from chaos to order, and that's where we stopped last week. And then now we're going to delve into part 2, which is from order back into chaos. Now, if you were not able to watch it last week, I would encourage you to take the time, go back and watch the video so you could kind of go into depth into some of the things we discussed. But I will also provide a synopsis here very quickly for what we discussed last week, because I know that a week's time is a lot, and it's easy to forget certain details. So in sum, last week we looked at the creation account, Genesis 1 through 2 primarily. And this is the Adamic covenant. Even though the term covenant is not used, you have the language of covenant, which is relationship, and the stipulation. And we looked at a couple of different things. First, we looked at how when the Bible opens up, the whole world is tohu vavohu, right? The whole world is formless and void. And hopefully you were able to slip in that tohu vavohu in a conversation with someone somewhere and impress them with your Hebrew. So the whole earth was kind of formless and void. And what you see is that God created order. He separated and he created order in the world. And so you see that God is a God of order, which again is a great lesson for our own spiritual lives. When God comes in, he creates order. Next, we looked at God's creation of humanity when he says that let us make the man in our image. And so what does that mean, in our image? Again, the best way to understand the text is the context. And what you see is right after he creates man in his image, he says that he shall have dominion over the entire earth. And so the emphasis there is that mankind is a representative of God on earth. Just as God is the king of the universe, so man is going to have dominion and be a king over the earth as well. And then we moved on to Genesis 2:15, and this was the Garden of Eden. Again, the kind of first purpose that you see where God, it says that he took man and he caused him to rest in the garden. Why? In order to worship and obey. In Genesis 2:15. And if you're just coming in here and you're reading your Bible and you're saying, hey, it says to cultivate and to keep it, I would encourage you, go look at the video and we kind of discuss some of the Hebrew and a different way of translating that phrase. And so mankind, when you kind of take a step back from Genesis 1 through 2, you see that man is in a great relationship with God, that he is God's representative as a king on earth, and that he's also functioning as a type of priest, because the Garden of Eden itself is set up like a temple, like a tabernacle that God's able to dwell in, and the terms worship and obey are often used for Levites when they're working in the temple. And so you have this theme of priest and king already in the Adamic covenant working together. And again, you see this theme throughout scripture. Later on, you see it with Israel, who's a kingdom of priests. You see it with David, who is both a king and he also functions as a priest at times. You see it, of course, with Yeshua, who in Hebrews, he's both a king as well as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek in Psalm 110. So a lot begins here, and Genesis 2:15 is really the core of the Adamic covenant. It's really kind of, if you're ever laying in bed and you're like, boy, like what is the purpose of life? Initially, what we find is that it's Genesis 2:15. It is to be with God in fellowship, to worship and obey in his presence. Now, of course, things don't stay in that utopian state. Things don't stay as great because of disobedience. Remember, with covenants, there are generally stipulations. And so for Adam, there was one stipulation. There was one command: do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, what does good and evil actually mean? The main point, like we spoke last week, was that it was about moral autonomy. It was about rejecting God's laws and saying, you know what, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so when they took of that fruit, which we're going to discuss today, when they took from the tree, they were declaring that they don't need God, and that's where the disobedience came in, and that's where the covenant relationship, at least, was fractured. So that was the main point from last week. Again, if you could think about the covenant, at least the first part, in 3 pillars, the Adamic covenant going from chaos to order. We spoke about 3 pillars. We spoke about man's relationship with God, where he's both a priest and a king. He's able to fellowship with God and represent God. We spoke about man's relationship with the woman. Remember when I said that, he looks at Eve, he says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. It's kind of like in the cartoons when, the dog's eyes would come out and he'd be so excited to see his wife. It says at the end of Genesis 2 that they were joined together, meaning they had deep harmony, and that they were naked together, signifying a transparency, meaning there was no guilt, there was no shame between them, that they were in perfect unity. So you have man's relationship with God, man's relationship with the woman, and then man's relationship with the animal kingdom. He had dominion over the animal kingdom, which may be represented when he actually named them. And that might be one of the indications of his dominion over them. So Genesis 2, it ends perfectly. We're in a utopian state. We're in this beautiful Adamic covenant. We went from chaos to order. But then when we get to part 2 of the Adamic covenant, which is going from order back to chaos. This is often called what we could say the fall of mankind. And the first thing that we see, remember our 3 pillars, man with God, man with the woman, man with the animal kingdom. The first thing we see is that this pillar starts to shift. And that now no longer is man having authority over the animal kingdom, but now the animal kingdom has authority over man by virtue of deceiving them. So this is the first interruption of the relationship. So Genesis 3:1 begins, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made." Now, if your Bible translates the term "now" or something like that in Genesis 3:1, that's great. I think that's a great translation. In Hebrew, generally what you have are verbs that really carry the narrative. Usually sentences start with verbs. So, and he said Moses to the people. So Moses said to the people. And he went, Moses, down the mountain. And Moses went down the mountain. In stories, they usually start with verbs. When they don't, that's what you call an offline clause. That's where the author is telling you, now hold on, I'm going to tell you something very important. Take a break here. Pay attention. Right? And one way I like to think about this is that, when you're online, or if you're on the internet, especially with working from home and all that, everything's going well, you're getting your things done, and then imagine everything goes offline. You're not getting anything done. You need to pause. That's what this offline clause does. So Genesis 1-2, God's creating, everything's great. You have the stipulation about not eating from the tree, but, man is in a utopia. He's loving his wife. And then Genesis 3:1, now. There's no verb. It wants you to pay attention. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field. And so you could just think about like a camera that kind of goes now over the serpent. You have some like scary music that's coming up. You realize something's wrong here. Also, when you look at Genesis 2:25, which is the last verse of chapter 2, and then Genesis 3:1, first verse of Genesis 3, you see a wordplay going on. When it says the man and his wife were both naked, the Hebrew word is arumim. But when it says now the serpent was more crafty, the Hebrew word is arum. And what you're going to see is that the arum of the serpent takes away the arumim of the man and the woman. So you see that first pillar starting to break down in terms of the animal kingdom. Now, the term crafty, it's actually not a bad term. In Proverbs 12, we're commanded to be crafty. We're commanded to, walk with craftiness, walk with intelligence, walk with wisdom. But what you see here, and I think a general rule is that no matter what God's giftings are, what his commands are, we could often use them for good or for evil. And so here we see that the serpent, he's being crafty, and it's going to be something negative for the story. Now we have our first interaction between the serpent and the woman. And we're not going to go into too much detail here, but the main point is that you have deception going on. And when the serpent, he approaches Eve in order to have her break that stipulation to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he comes to her, and what he does is he paints God like an oppressor rather than a protector. Right? He takes God's rule and he says God is oppressing her. He's keeping her from the fun. He's keeping her from good things rather than a protector of protecting their relationship. So he's painting a very skewed idea of what is happening in this story. And you see that when he asks her, he says, indeed, he said to the woman, has God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? But of course, the command was not any tree. It was the tree you shall not eat from. So you see, he's saying, God told you you can't do anything in this place. You can't eat from any tree. Now, initially, Eve responds pretty well, and she corrects him. Or rather, her name is not Eve yet, but the woman responds pretty well, and she corrects him. But she also includes her own exaggeration. And so you see, even though she corrected him, she might view that God is oppressing as well. She might have bought into that idea. The woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it." Great. But she continued, "Or touch it, or you will die." But the thing is, God never said you shall not touch it. So you already see that the serpent, he in order to get her to turn away from God, he had to make her doubt. He had to make her question God's intentions as a suppressor rather than a protector. And even though the woman corrected him, she still added this additional element, "or touch it," which made God seem more like an oppressor. So eventually the serpent comes and he eventually calls God an outright liar. It says in Genesis 3:5, "For God knows that in the day that you eat from it, from the tree, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So what is he saying here? There's some debate whether you will be like God or you will be like gods, because Elohim is a plural term, which is the term used for God. But the idea is when you eat of it, you will be like the great beings. You will be like the celestial beings. You will be able to make your own decisions and have autonomy. You don't need to listen to God anymore. So he came out with that outright lie. And then when the woman, it says that she saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from the fruit and ate, and she also gave her husband, and he ate. Now, this whole sequence, good for food, delight of the eyes, desirable to make one wise, this actually, many commentators connect this with 1 John 2:16. 1 John 2:16, which really speaks about what is in the world. And it's the lust of the flesh, good for food, the lust of the eyes, delight of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, desirable to make one wise. So she eats of the fruit, she eats of the tree, and she also gives to her husband. So right here, that pillar with mankind having dominion over the animals, now we see that shifted. They were deceived by the animals. Next, we're going to go to the next pillar, man and the woman, that's also going to break down. It says that the eyes of both of them were open and that they were naked and that they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. So remember, Genesis 3 and Genesis 2, they were naked, they were transparent, there was no shame, there was no guilt. Now they were hiding themselves up. It signified shame and a broken fellowship. And this broken fellowship really comes up when God comes and he asks, "Hey, Adam, what did you do?" And Adam's like, "Hey, it wasn't me. It was the woman you gave me." Right? So much for bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Now he's blaming her as though it's all her fault. So the first pillar, man and the animals. The second pillar, man and the woman. And then finally, the man and God. You see that broken relationship. It says in Genesis 3:8, "Then they heard the sound of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day." As an aside, some people translate this kind of like a stormy day, so it makes it a little bit scarier. But they heard the sound of God walking, and the man and the wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. When you hide from God, you think about the temple and you think about how the priests had to prepare themselves and how they anticipated greeting God and meeting God, and how they would get to even at Mount Sinai, the anticipation of seeing God and meeting God. And yet here, Adam has to hide from God. And this whole theme of hiding, in Isaiah, often God hides from Israel. He says, "I'm going to turn my face away from you" in Israel. But the reason for hiding is always because of sin. And so here, for the first time, mankind, even though they had that beautiful relationship, are hiding from God. And so that signified the broken relationship. And then the Lord God called out to Adam, to the man, and he said to him, "Where are you?" Now, people say, you see, God doesn't know all things. I don't think you could derive that conclusion from this portion and the fact that he asked this question. In Genesis 4, for example, remember when Cain kills Abel and God says to Cain, "Where's your brother?" And Cain's like, "I have no idea. I'm not my brother's keeper." And then God says, "The blood of your brother is crying out to me." Right? God knows what happened, but he's giving an opportunity for confession. And that's what I love. Even in the midst of this judgment, the relationship is still there. God is saying, "Where are you?" He's calling out in the midst of them hiding. And so this shows that, all three pillars, Genesis 1 through 2, 2 chapters, these three pillars were created in a matter of 8 verses. The whole thing is destroyed. These three pillars, God with man, God with woman, God with the animals, are all switched around. And what this shows is the impact of chaos, the impact of sin. I alluded to this last time, but when Paul, he says, a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. A little bit of sin spreads everywhere. For me, I love to play a sport called squash. And it's a little bit taxing on the body. It's a lot of, jumping forward and jumping back. And I still do, have quite a few back problems because of that. And I used to go to, chiropractors and physiotherapists in order to get help. And one thing they would always be saying to me is, remember, your whole body is connected. Sounds obvious, easy to forget, right? Because the shoulders are connected to the back, which are connected to the legs, which are connected all over. And so if you neglect one part, if I don't stretch out my back, or if I don't stretch my legs, but I stretch elsewhere, it's going to still negatively impact me. Everything is connected. And in the same way, our lives are all connected. It's not like we could just have a little bit of sin or a little bit of rebellion and then, not allow that to touch anything else. It's all connected everywhere and it spreads. And here we see the impact of chaos. It went all over and it ruined the man's relationship with God, with the woman, and with the animal kingdom. One illustration I like to give about this is if you play an instrument. I play guitar, and guitar has 6 strings, and they all have to be in tune with each other. And so when you play a chord that uses all 6 strings, it's beautiful when it's all in harmony together. But if I just took one string and I just turned it and made it out of tune and played that same chord, it's going to sound terrible. The one little bit will change the entire thing. And then you have a choice. Either you fix that one string, or you have to change everything else to conform to it. And so here we have sin. We cannot just leave it festering and doing what it wants. It will spread all over. And so we see that in the Adamic covenant. And so this really leads us to part 2 of the Adamic covenant. This is letter D under point 2 in your outline. And this is where we have the consequences. See, at this point, God doesn't just throw and destroy all of humanity and kind of restart on a different planet. Here, God provides consequences. And I think that is very much a sign of graciousness. There are consequences, but there's still that future redemption, that future hope that we're going to be in relationship with God. So God goes to man. He says what happened. Man blamed the woman. The woman, God asks what happened. She blamed the serpent. And then God begins with the serpent. He judges the serpent, then the woman, then the man. So we're going to look at these judgments a little bit closely here. First, he judges the serpent in Genesis 3:14. Now, Genesis 3:14, he kind of focuses on the physical aspects of the serpent. And then Genesis 3:15, he focuses on, I believe, the entity or the being behind the serpent. So, Genesis 3:14, he goes to the serpent and he says, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle." So the serpent went from the craftiest to now the most cursed in the entire animal kingdom. And he tells him, "On your belly you will go, and you will eat dust, you will eat dust all the days of your life." Some people conclude from this that the serpents had legs before, and they appeal to some scientific discoveries of that. I don't know if that's a necessary conclusion from this statement here. What could also be happening is that God is giving a new significance to the fact that serpents slither. And you see this, for example, with circumcision. When God told Abraham to start circumcising, this became a sign between him and God, but other communities circumcised. So God was just kind of renewing the meaning of what that meant and giving it a new importance. So here, the fact that the serpent slithers, it now represents his cursed state. And we see it kind of foreshadows because Israel, they weren't allowed to eat anything that was on their belly because they were deemed unclean. So now the serpent is represented as something unclean. And then it says, thus will be the food of the serpent. And this just signifies his cursed state. He's always going to be on the ground. This is actually a term used for some of the enemies of Israel. Okay, so Genesis 3:14, he focuses on the serpent, the physical, but then Genesis 3:15, there seems to be a shift where God focuses on the being behind the serpent. And one of the reasons for that, when he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, the term enmity used in the Hebrew Bible is only used 5 times, but it's always used between moral agents, meaning people who are able to be accountable for their actions. And so here he says that I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman. And just as an aside, another thing to consider that I think we often forget is, I remember I was teaching on Genesis 3 and, it's a famous messianic prophecy. We're talking about some details and someone raised their hand and said, what do you do with a talking snake? Which I thought, that's a great question, allowing us to kind of step back because, when you're so familiar with the story, it's easy to kind of just take things for granted. But I think the notion that the serpent is talking shows there's something more going on. There's only 2 times in the Hebrew Bible where animals speak. That's here and then in Numbers with Balaam and his donkey. And in both times, there's a supernatural thing happening. This isn't just kind of normalized. And so that's why I think that there is an agent behind the serpent who God is now addressing. And here, I believe he gives that agent who is the devil, who's Satan, he gives that agent the death sentence. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. I will put hatred between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. So what Satan produces and what the woman produces, which are children. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. This right here is believed to be the first prophecy, the first messianic expectation of a Messiah who's going to come from a woman who is going to crush the head of the serpent. And this right here, I believe, is the death sentence that God gives to Satan for what he did. Now, as an aside, there is some debate, usually in Jewish commentaries. If you look at the Targums, for example, the he shall bruise you on the head is interpreted as Israel, or as a corporate kind of person, like a nation of some sort. But I think the best way to read this is as an individual, because the singular pronoun he is used here. And so the seed of the woman is a person who's going to come and crush the head. What that shows is that even in the midst of this judgment, even in the midst of God condemning, he gives hope for the people. You can imagine Adam and his wife listening and hearing, oh my goodness, there's going to be a Redeemer who's going to come, who's going to cast judgment. And so then a lot of the Hebrew Bible is now you're tracing the seed. Who is the seed of this woman? Where is he going to come from? From where will redemption come? So we go on. That's the judgment against the serpent. Then we move on to our next point, which is the judgment against the woman. And here, a major explanation is why are things the way that they are. And so first, he tells the woman, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. Now imagine, earlier on he says that Adam and Eve, or Adam and the woman, they are commanded to be fruitful and to multiply. They still have that command, but now there's going to be great pain in childbirth. And so that's one of the consequences that we have. The second thing is that her desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over you. And so remember that they were naked, they were unashamed, they had that perfect harmony. Now there's going to be that competition, that turmoil. There's a lot of debate as to what it actually means, that your desire will be for your husband. but we know that it has negative implications. In Genesis 4:7, for example, the same term is used where God is talking to Cain, and it says that sin has a desire for you. Its desire is for you, and so it's something that is negative. So God judges the serpent, he judges the woman in terms of childbirth and the desire, and then he judges the man. And here the emphasis is on the man working from the sweat of his brow. Cursed is the ground because of you, in toil you will eat of it. So in the Garden of Eden, remember, we often translate it that they were there in order to cultivate and to keep it as though they were gardeners. In Genesis 2:15, I think the main point was the fellowship with God, but now they have to work from the sweat of their brow and working from the ground that is cursed. So that's the first thing, and then the second thing is that they will physically die. To dust you shall return. So in the midst of all of this, it's easy to look at this narrative and to say, why did God create the serpent? Why did God create Satan? Why did God allow this to happen? And those are definitely valid questions. The book of Job really wrestles with, why do bad things happen to good people? And while that's a valid question, there's another way to look at this, which is, wow, in the midst of our disobedience, God was still gracious. In the midst of our obedience, God promised a messianic redeemer. In the midst of our disobedience, God still allowed us to live on, that he didn't destroy us right away. And so there's two kind of different ways to look at this, that we see God interacting, continuing in relationship with humanity. And this is what kind of brings us to our third point, the third and final section, the conclusion, which is the hope of redemption. So remember, you have from chaos to order, from order back to chaos, which is what we just saw. That relationship is kind of interrupted, but then there is that hope of redemption. There is that hope that a messianic figure will come. So how do we think about this Adamic covenant? Why is this covenant so important? First thing, remember that the Adamic covenant, and you could write this down, it really provides an etiology. And what that means is it tells us why things are the way that they are. Why is it that serpents slither? Why is it that it hurts to give birth? Why do we have to work by the sweat of our brow? And so, again, you're laying at night and you're kind of wondering the purpose of my life. Think of Genesis 2:15. If you're laying in your bed wondering, why are things so bad? Remember, we live in a cursed world. And this all comes back to the Adamic covenant. This was judgment for rebellion. We lived in a cursed world. So remember, the Adamic covenant, it's made with the entire world, and it provides an etiology. Second is that the Adamic covenant, it sets the stage for God's future redemption. God's future redemption with his people. So in Genesis 2:15, you have this relationship with God, yet Adam and the woman are kicked out of the garden at the end of Genesis 3, and you're wondering, well, then what happens? What happens to that relationship? But again, God is a relational God. And so remember that book I shared last week, From Paradise to the Promised Land? A major theme that we see is that God is restoring the people back to relationship with him. And so while he dwelt in the Garden of Eden, and then that fellowship was broken, he later dwells in the tabernacle so we can know him. He dwells in the temple so we can know him. And then it says Yeshua came down and tabernacled with us in the book of John. And so it's like God coming down now, his Shekinah, his presence coming down and being with us. And then, of course, we look forward to a physical reign where God will dwell again. So the entire purpose of our lives at this point, and you see throughout history, is being in this relationship with God. Now, we still live in a cursed state. In Romans 8:22, Paul speaks about this, and he says, "For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now." We are still living in a cursed state, and I think that we can't expect a utopia. However, there is hope. In Isaiah 65 and 66, the prophet, he's talking about this, what he calls the new heavens and new earth. He's talking about this future age. And what's amazing when you read through it is that most of the curses that you see in Genesis 3 are reversed. It says in verse 23, people will not toil in vain. Just like Adam was, he's going to toil hard. That giving birth will not hurt in verse 23. So the curse of the woman will be reversed. That the seed will be blessed. So all the curses will be finished. But notice, in Isaiah 66, it says, even in the midst of all this great stuff, even in the midst of harmony with the animal kingdom, it says, quote, dust will be the serpent's food. Just like Genesis 3:14. Meaning that the serpent will remain kind of that symbol of the cursed state. And this is why, since that will go on, this is why the Adamic covenant is viewed as unconditional. It goes on forever. While there are changes, obviously with relationships and stipulations, it is considered an unconditional covenant that we are still under today. So the last thing I want to kind of hit home here is this hope in the Messiah. There is a debate. I've gone to Christian schools where they would say there are no messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Bible, or that there's only one and it's Isaiah 53. And the question is Genesis 3:15 a messianic prophecy? And once again, the best way to understand the text is by looking at the context. And I think that by looking at Adam's response as well as the woman's response, you're going to see that they had a hope of a redeemer. And so first we have Adam's response here, and I absolutely love this. You can imagine how Adam is feeling, where he just, really kind of blew it. Like he had that one stipulation and he did something really wrong. And he could feel guilty. He could feel like, oh, what am I going to do? He could feel like, I don't want to talk to anyone. But notice what he does. And this is right after the curses. Notice what he does. It says, now the man called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all the living. So Adam was just promised death, physical death. To dust you shall return. And yet he turns around and calls his wife the mother of all the living. Now, if I were there, I would say, why don't we, say, don't ever listen to serpents, or boy, we really messed up, or something like that. But Adam wasn't focusing on what he did wrong. He was focusing on the promise that God gave, which was that out of the seed of the woman, a redeemer was going to come. And so he called his wife Eve, which is the mother of all the living. He had that messianic hope. He does not stay in any guilt. And then also, when you get to Genesis 4:1, this is where Eve, his wife, actually gives birth for the first time. And you have a really interesting phrase here. It says, now the man had relations with his wife Eve. She conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Now, when you actually look at Hebrew, with the help of is not there. So literally it's, I have gotten a man-child, the Lord. And so there's all this discussion. Did she think that she was giving birth to the Lord, that he would be the Redeemer? Was she only relying on him for help? I don't think we could conclude one way or another too strongly, but what you see here is a supernatural birth. She understood that God intervened and allowed her to give birth. Life will continue on in a cursed state, but with the hope of redemption. And it's that hope that we follow, and it's the seed of the woman that we follow into the next covenants. So that concludes our Adamic covenant, part 1 and part 2. Main points for this covenant is that it's a covenant made with the world. It's unconditional. It establishes our relationship with God. While we are currently in a cursed state, we are looking forward to that future redemption. And so moving on now, when we get to chapter 4, we're going to go to the Noahic covenant next week. We're going to get to chapter 6. I encourage you to read through Genesis 4 through 9. Okay, because that's kind of like ending off from the Adamic, going all the way to the Noahic. I would encourage you to read it. And what you're going to see is a couple of genealogies, and you might wonder, why are we studying genealogies? What's the purpose of these? And this is what I would ask you to keep in mind. Remember, you're tracing the seed of the woman. You're trying to see, where is this seed going to come out of? Who is carrying this seed? So you're going to have Cain, you're going to have Seth, you're going to have a godly line and an ungodly line. Who is carrying this seed? So as you follow it, I think it'll make it a little more fun as you're going through these genealogies. So that concludes our Adamic covenant. And we will see you next week for the Noahic covenant. Be blessed.